This week's blog post is the first of two on the Museum of the American Arts and Crafts movement. The Museum of the American Arts and Crafts movement is one of the newest museums in downtown St. Petersburg, Florida. It opened in 2021. It is privately funded by Rudy Ciccarello, who has been collecting objects of the arts and crafts movement since the 1990s. The MAACM is the only museum dedicated to such works. What, you may be asking, is the arts and crafts movement? Its origins can be traced back to writings on architecture in the 1840s and 50s by John Ruskin, Britain's most prominent art critic. Ruskin condemned Renaissance and modern, which to him was Victorian, architecture. He insisted that art and architecture express the social and moral conditions under which they were produced. Hence, Ruskin argued, perfect style of architecture for Britain, that burgeoning industrial power, was Venetian Gothic, a medieval style from the 13th to 15th centuries. That's on the left, an example. Influenced by Ruskin and by a love of medieval art, William Morris rejected the, quote, dull squalor of civilization, end quote, by which he meant the low-cost, mass-produced goods of the Industrial Revolution. Morris argued that there should be no dividing line between fine arts and decorative arts. In 1861, he established an association of fine art workmen, later Morris and Company, to produce objects that were both beautiful and functional, such as handmade stained glass, metalwork, furniture, textiles, such as the example on the right, wallpaper, and so on. Morris became the leading figure of the arts and crafts movement, which by the 1890s revolutionized Victorian decorative arts. The arts and crafts movement spread to the United States, lasting from the 1890s through the 1920s. Objects produced during that period remained strikingly beautiful for their elegant design and remarkably durable for their high-quality materials. Artists and artisans represented at the MAACM include Frank Lloyd Wright, Charles Rolfs, Gustav Stickley, the Roycrofters, Green and Green, Louis Sullivan, and the Rookwood Pottery. Artworks range from furniture, pottery, and tiles to lighting, textiles, photography, woodblocks, metalwork, and period rooms. A few words on the MAACM's building. The five-story building was designed by Alfonso Architects. It's 137,000 square feet. It's quite large. Includes 40,000 feet of gallery space, a sun-filled atrium, a spiral staircase, a reference library, an event space, and an upscale restaurant and cafe. Let's move on to furniture. I want to show you a few pieces by Charles Rolfs. As a young man, Rolfs, 1853 to 1936, earned several patents for designs of cast iron stoves. After marrying Anna Catherine Green, one of the first American writers of detective fiction, in 1884, he began producing furniture as a hobby. Beginning in 1897, Rolfs sold furniture commercially, but in very small quantities. His unique style shows the influence of the arts and crafts movement, Glasgow School, Art Nouveau, Gothic Revival, East Asian art, and maybe a little bit of cast iron stove making. One of my favorite Rolfs pieces at the MAACM is this music stand. In the 19th century, before the advent of the phonograph, most middle-class Americans owned musical instruments. A few fortunate ones also had this elaborate revolving stand with its assortment of retractable shelving and arms to hold sheet music. This is another Rolfs item, a cupboard with a safe in its base, which is guarded by a bulldog. And finally, this armchair by Rolfs is fascinating to look at, but I don't know anyone who has posture good enough to sit in it comfortably. Moving on to another artist, this is a Manxman piano. It was designed by Robert Ashby in 1902. By the late 1800s, upright pianos were very popular in middle and upper class homes. Mackay Hugh Bailey Scott, 1865 to 1945, who was a leader in the arts and crafts movement, designed a new type of case for the piano, one with doors to enclose the keyboard music stand, and light holders. When opened, there was much room for elegant decoration. Here, the plain oak case opens to show enameled flowers on the sides and top. The style of piano case was dubbed Manxman because Scott lived for some time on the Isle of Man. I've given you a link to an article with more about Manxman pianos. Moving on to Frank Lloyd Wright. This piece is by George Mann Nudeken and Frank Lloyd Wright, who designed the desk for the Conley House, constructed circa 1908 to 1910. Nudeken worked on interiors with Wright. The desk fits seamlessly with the prairie style of the Conley House. According to the label at the MAACM, the desk is actually a contemporary copy, probably produced by the manufacturer who did the original to Frank Lloyd Wright's plans. There will be another Frank Lloyd Wright work in the next blog post. Meanwhile, we move on to illustrations. The MAACM's gallery with illustrations of the arts and crafts period has not only original works, copies of the books they appeared in. I like that because it reminds me that the colors in books are not necessarily the colors of the original works. That's especially important when looking at an artist like Maxfield Parrish. This work is by Sarah S. Stilwell Weber. It's called Harmony in the Light of the Moon, and it was painted around 1903. It was done as an illustration for Richard Le Gallienne's poem The Pine Lady, a character who emerges at night to sing to the moon and lay your soul away on a harp. She's high in the boughs of her haunted house, where the moon and she are sitting. Alas, I can't find that whole poem online, except behind a paywall in Harper's Magazine. And finally, Jessie Wilcox Smith was one of the greatest children's book illustrators of her time. She was also in demand for illustrating stories in magazines such as Collier's Weekly, Harper's Bazaar, McClure's, Scribner's, and Women's Home Companion. She also did advertisements for Kodak, Procter & Gamble, Ivory Soap, and others. This is her illustration, Then the Epicure, the Third Age, for Carolyn Wells's 7 Ages of Childhood, published in 1909. Next week, we'll see a selection of lamps, windows, and ceramics at the MAACM. If you like this sort of brief look at museums, go to the museums tag on my website and you'll find many more. DianeDuranteWriter.com has hundreds of posts on sculpture, painting, architecture, and my other obsessions. To join the Sunday Recommendations email list, visit the URL on the screen or email me. You can say, "Well done, Diane," or support my work and receive rewards by means of the tip jar on DianeDuranteWriter.com. As always, thank you for listening.